Okay, good. Well, folks, I wish that I had some really great, interesting, fun, exciting news about emotion regulation techniques and psychosis. But alas, the field has not advanced that much since the last time I gave this talk. So we're going to review this. One of the things that I was trying to do last night before kind of as I was reviewing this was to try to find articles about emotion regulation that were new, 2023 type articles. And the one thing that I did find, which I didn't have time to write anything on, was emotion regulation of family members. So I've got an article about that sitting up on my computer, and I'm gonna send it to Jamie, or Sandy, who may be able to send that all out to you. It's interesting, particularly in light of how families need to pull together and support each other. And I was really most interested in this article, and I'll get on with the other thing here quick. But I was most interested in that the belief of family members often is that my life direction has to stop because of this disease, because I have to take care of somebody in my family. And it gives a number of techniques and different orientations to use to help family members get beyond that unhelpful belief that things in their life have to stop in order to support the person that they're living with. At any rate, I wanted to add that little new piece of information in. So emotion regulation is difficult, as we know. And when we begin to work with it with schizophrenia and psychosis, know that it gets worse before it gets better. And that's kind of the name of the game with everything that we work with when we start to treat it and ask people to begin to challenge their beliefs and challenge their behaviors. So what we want to do is to be particularly cognizant of internal distress when we start to work with emotions and help people begin to identify that and comment on it and begin to actually dig in and work with that. So let's take a look at what the, I guess, the architecture of an emotion is. An emotion is a complicated thing. It's basically a response to some outside stimuli that happens, or maybe to an internal thing that happens, like a thought. And it contains all these different components, that outward expression, what my experience is inside, my physiology, my neurological arousal. Okay. And so emotion regulation is the ability to identify an emotion and express it appropriately, in coordination with the environment, adapting with the environment as well. And of course, we all know that each of us carry our emotions differently and have different experiences of them. And so one thing, a spider, we were talking about this yesterday when I was at the centers, spiders and bugs. Yep, Amy's going, yeah, I remember that conversation. Can really freak some people out, and then other people, bugs and spiders, don't freak anybody out. And why is that? And that's because we bring our genetics with us, along with our life experiences that are packed into bags that we carry into life, and that influences how we respond to the outside world or our inside world. Emotion areas of the brain always fascinated me, and so the insula and the amygdala are two parts of the brain that are heavy in terms of emotion regulation. The insula helps us put together our physical experience along with the emotion that we're having. It helps to keep our experience balanced in some way. It also kind of helps to keep our parasympathetic and sympathetic systems in balance as well, regulates the immune system, does a lot of work. And it helps to integrate all that information from the amygdala, which is the emotion center of the brain. We know that. And we also know that the amygdala is storing basically everything that we experience and relating that to it either being safe or not safe or neutral. And it's going to err on the side of caution. So whenever it sees anything remotely unsafe, it's going to categorize it as that. And your brain is going to remember that whether the situation was actually safe or not. And so that's how immediate pairing happens, that conditioned response. And we begin to pair a reaction from our amygdala to some outside or internal stimuli, and that sets up the fear response, right? Doesn't matter whether it's rational or not, that's what the brain does. And so we have, wow, what is this little thing here? The insula and amygdala work together to upregulate emotional processing. And what happens is that interferes sometimes with the ability to read emotions expressed by another person, which is kind of interesting. Okay. There's other parts of the brain that are involved in the awareness and expression of emotions. These two parts of the brain actually have a pretty clean association with each other. They work together, part and parcel. Experienced emotions in the presence of either positive or negative. A person with psychosis or schizophrenia is probably going to be not as efficient at processing emotions, reading it in themselves or somebody else. Their experience of an emotion might be the same as yours or mine, but they have a difficult time understanding it, and their reactivity to it is going to be a little bit higher. So while they experience the same things that we do, their outward behavior is going to be different. The processing of emotions is just so much more difficult, and we know that because it's clear that that's the case, but we also know that emotion regulation is tied with social skill functioning as well. So the whole communication thing is disrupted when emotions are disrupted. I can't read other people's emotions. I can't process my own, right? People with schizophrenia recruit the parts of the emotional parts of their brains differently than we do. Their face may be flat. It may look like they're not experiencing anything at all, but their insides may be rolling around with all kinds of emotions that their body just is not able to put forth and express, right? So when we're working, when I work with people with schizophrenia, sometimes I feel like they're looking at me in complete bewilderment without understanding anything that I'm saying. But the fact is that they are taking in some of that stuff and they are responding to what I'm saying. They're just not expressing it because there's something in that emotion expression and processing that's not good for them. So for all of us, there's two ways that we can deal with emotions. One is to suppress, and the other is to reappraise. It's true for all of us. Those of us who suppress information or emotional events that need to be processed, that suppression process takes place later in the process of dealing with emotions. Because it happens later, it's almost like we have to think about it, and that takes up brain capacity for us to manage, takes up brain capacity for memory and concentration, because suppression is harder to do. If we look at a situation and see the situation and accept it and work with it at as much as possible in the moment without suppressing, that behavior happens early on in the process of dealing with emotions. And so that frees up the person to use their prefrontal cortex a little bit more, think through things, think through consequences, and reappraise the situation and come to some meaningful outcome. So reappraisal as opposed to suppression, reappraisal is going to win out every time. But of course, somebody with psychosis has a lot of fear and panic on board. And so their initial inclination is going to be to suppress, which then downregulates the ability to think and process and move through that decision-making process of, what are my consequences if I behave this particular way? So I've already kind of been through that. Those with schizophrenia use the lowest amount of reappraisal skill. Those in clinical high risk are in the same kind of predicament. Those who have psychotic-like experiences but are not in full-blown psychosis use a little bit more of the reappraisal. And in general, those of us without psychosis or severe mental illness use the most amount of reappraisal. Now alexithymia is something, are you guys familiar with alexithymia, what that is and what that means? Okay. Those with alexithymia tend to suppress a little bit more. Alexithymia is basically having a lack of words for emotions. Doesn't mean you don't really have them, but you don't have the word for it. Is my door closed? My husband has alexithymia. So when I ask him, how do you feel? He'll say, I know I feel something, but I don't have any words to describe it. And about 10% of us in the general population have alexithymia. And it's just something that some of us have. Those of us with psychosis and schizophrenia tend to have it quite a bit more. And those with alexithymia have a little bit harder of a time picking out contextual information in order to make sense of the situation, in order to regulate our emotions, right? Although they tend to be flatter. And they have a hard time reading other people as well. Okay. So between 5 and 10% of our population, the general population, does have an experience of alexithymia. There's two different kinds. There's state trait or state and trait. State is after an event and you get kind of numb and you can't express your emotions or can't identify them well. And trait is thought to be more lifelike, long life term. So my husband is more that way. There is a cognitive and an affective component of that. So when I ask my husband, can you tell me about the emotion? Can you tell me what's happening? It's really hard for him to do that until about several hours after he's had that experience. He can do it. It just happens several hours later because of the amount of processing time it takes him. Whereas I process like immediately and I'm all over the place. Okay. So when we have psychosis on board, people with alexithymia are just not as verbal and don't have as good ability to just simply say what's happening. So those people with schizophrenia who are more verbal, who are less alexithymic, are going to have obviously an easier time with emotion regulation. Those who are less verbal are going to have a harder time with that, and we're going to have to help them with their words. So, I'm not going to beat a dead horse here. Y'all know how to do emotion in the clinical room, which is, they're temporary, they come and go. We address the myths, and we help people to know the names of the emotions as well, and that they do not last, right? So as Harry always says, once you name an emotion, the intensity of the emotion drops almost immediately, all right? And so getting people to name it, identify it, accept it, and work with it is obviously the name of the game. It's a tall order, though, obviously. So what we say to ourselves messes with our ability to regulate emotion. I can't handle this. This is never going to work. I'm going to fail. Those are all things that disrupt emotion regulation, and so we have to work cognitively with this stuff in order to teach our clients that they can tolerate this, that they have already tolerated this distress, whatever that is, and they're managing, and we have to find ways to show them that they're actually doing it, and teach them, work with them, collaborate with them to fine tune how they're already doing it and help them to do it better. Checking in, phrases of support are all helpful. Using an emotion chart is really helpful. I put primary emotions on the left-hand side and flavors of emotions up all across of each of those. So all of these here in the blue are flavors of sad. All of these in the orange are flavors of anger. We can mix and match these primary emotions to make any of these emotions in here in the larger chart. I always start with primary emotions because it's easier to teach. It's very simple. These are the 7 main emotions, right? Let's start there, and then we can move out into identifying things like irritation and frustration. Let's just start with those 7 main feelings at first. Play emotion games, right? This was naming an emotion or dropping a penny on an emotion card, and then everybody in the room saying some story that fits with that emotion is helping people to discover what emotions are and where they are, and we should participate in that as well. Here's my little penny dropping down. We teach reappraisal, exposure, and then metacognition. You are all familiar with those 3 things. Metacognition, of course, being, I think, the most difficult, which is thinking about thinking. And so that involves a lot of acceptance and commitment therapy techniques come out of that, use metacognition, where we're imagining in a mindful way what an emotion is from a distant place. So we can examine it and look at it neutrally, examine how we respond to it, different ways that we can respond to it that can be helpful. We use detachment, acceptance, and compassion and mindfulness. None of you, I think, are unfamiliar with that, right? So I'm not gonna kind of beat that anymore. 3rd wave mindfulness is good. Remember, when you're doing that with people with schizophrenia, you don't want to leave elongated periods of silence when you're doing mindfulness, but to guide them all the way through. Mindfulness is very, very effective with schizophrenia as long as we're following those tweaks and not allowing those elongated periods of silence to take root where the symptoms can bloom, right? And quite frankly, those mindfulness techniques are pretty immediate in terms of their ability to help regulate emotions. So it's if there's a person who's really practicing, it's going to work better than Xanax, right? It's going to work better than medication if we can help a person really train themselves to do that. All kinds of mindfulness techniques. One of the things that I would recommend that you do is, if you do mindfulness for emotion regulation, is that you practice it yourself on a regular basis as well. So that's sitting and meditating or doing your own guided meditation so that you're familiar with what the experience is for real, what a mindfulness experience is, which is truly being able to detach and look at an event or a situation or a thought or whatever we're having an emotional experience about in a distanced way, neutral, without judgment. That is an amazing experience, actually, if you can get yourself to it, and it's much easier to teach if you have that experience. Clearly, when we're working with emotions, we can come at either end, any of the 3 ends of this triangle. If you're not getting at emotions through working directly with emotions, go to thoughts or go to behaviors, and that will change things in the other parts of the triangle. Go slowly. Remind your client that things are going to get worse before they get better, and build up their ability to tolerate the emotion before you go deep, right? So I think that probably the best way to go is to do emotion distress tolerance activities before you actually dive into working with the emotions, so that they know what to do when they get there. If that makes sense. Are we at the end here? Oh, is there no more? There we go. That's it. We're at the end.